Okay, let's try this other one. Let's see if we can audio here. Okay, looks like this is better. Okay, yeah, it looks like I have audio now. Let me bring this a little bit closer in case it's too far ahead. Hopefully this works throughout because this microphone is not as good as the standard one I was using. But it looks like you guys can hear me now, so just bear with me for this session. Apologies for that. We usually don't have that type of technical issue. Um, okay, so it looks like audio should be working again. If you have any troubles, just click the audio button at the bottom, change your settings. You can select a different speaker. Your microphone won't matter, obviously, but select a different speaker for whatever you may be using, just to ensure that you're dealing with your.
Try to see if we can get this a bit clearer for you all. Fortunately, I have some backup, so let me see if we can make this work. Okay, that should work a little bit better. Let me try one more option and I'll see, because I'm worried that a couple of you still have a little bit of an echo. Um, okay, I guess it seems like this last switch, everybody is having a little bit better situation. Okay, perfect. Excellent. Okay, my apologies for that delay. We usually don't have sound or video technical issues, but thanks for your patience. I appreciate it. Thanks for joining in chat as well. I always try to make sure that the chat is open, so you should be able to talk to other attendees, talk to me while we're in session. We've got over 100 people here today, so this is a great turnout for this one. I'm not surprised for something as straightforward as abstract preparation. It's a pretty popular topic. Um, so by way of introduction to get started, because some of you won't know me, I'm Dr. Clark Holdsworth. I'm a senior manager for partnerships and communications at LetPub. I have um, coming up on a decade of writing experience with authors across a variety of fields. I'll get into my full introduction when I get to that slide. But what you have today is our January installment, our very first installment of the new 2025 year for the LetPub webinar series. So today we'll be covering crafting and wordsmithing the perfect abstract using our easy step-by-step process. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items for you all. For some of you, this will be old hat. You've already been attending the webinar series. But just again, briefly, so you have a chat now at the bottom, which you can utilize. Again, you can chat there. You can leave questions there. What I do suggest though is that there's actually a function specifically for Q&A. So if you go ahead and open that now, you can see that I have it open right from the beginning, and you can enter questions at any time during this. I assume several people will have questions that they've prepped coming into it. There's something that they want answered just simply based on this topic. Feel free to leave your questions at any time throughout if you would like. That way I can get to them first thing at the end. In particular, if you do need to drop out at any point, you've got something else going on in your schedule, that's absolutely no problem, because this is an on-demand webinar. So this webinar is being recorded, and with the registration you already have entered, you will have access to it on demand after. So if you're not able to stay for the full, the entirety of the time, you can also feel free to share that link with anyone else. I'm more than happy for this webinar to be accessed by more people. What's going to happen is you're going to get a follow-up email within 24 hours of the conclusion of this webinar. It's going to have a link to the on-demand recording so that you can utilize that. It's also going to have a link that you can click on to generate your certificate of completion. Okay, so be on the lookout for that email. Your certificate of completion or certificate of participation for this webinar will be available in that automated email. If after 24 hours, for some reason you didn't get the email, just check spam, this type of thing. But if you can't find the email, just reach out to PeerRef and they'll be able to get you a copy. All right. Okay, so with those housekeeping items out of the way, we can get started. Oh, one final thing I just want to mention before we start. Some of you may have questions about wordsmithing and brevity and how to reduce word count. It's probably the most common thing with abstract writing. If anybody has example sentences that they're struggling with or have previously struggled with in their own abstracts, you can actually leave that in the Q&A for me, and I would be very happy to go over these individual examples with the group. It's an easy way for me to demonstrate some of the principles I'm going to cover here on how to wordsmith, how to get that character count, how to get that word count under these really, really strict limits. So if anybody has any of those, feel free to include them in the Q&A, and I'll cover them at the end. Okay, let's get us started. Okay, as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Clark Holdsworth at LetPub. My background, just for your knowledge, is in physiology, so I'm a life scientist. That will color a bit of the picture of the different examples I tend to discuss for abstracts. Keep in mind, though, that I've worked with authors across every field: humanities, mathematics, engineering, physics, the life sciences, of course. So I've seen pretty much everything across thousands and thousands of manuscripts. So I do have that to draw on, but sometimes I will use examples that are from the life sciences, just so you're aware. Okay, to get started. So starting off with the basics, how we're defining the abstracts. If you're here, you tend to know what it is, but it helps to edify it a little bit. So an abstract is a brief summary of your published or unpublished research paper. Quite often that could just be a study, is the more broad way to address it. It's generally one full paragraph, and it's either structured or unstructured. Even if it's unstructured, it tends to follow the same structure as what we formally call a structured abstract. What a structured abstract means is that it simply has these specific sections that have a title, like background, methods, results, conclusions, which I'll go over here. But even if it's not specified that those have to be included in the format required by the journal, by the conference, etc., your abstract will still be following this type of structure. You may just not have these headings within it. Generally, it's 150 to 350 words, again, depending on the limits from the conference or the journal. Some are much more. I've seen places where abstracts can go up to 500 words. They're not really concerned about these word count limits, but most major conferences you're going to are not going to allow those sorts of limits. So generally it falls within 150 to 350 words. 150 is generally the shortest I see, and it's incredibly difficult. 150 words is not much, but I do occasionally see it. I think it's more common in some humanities titles where they're accepting just shorter, briefer summarizations because there is less of that structure to go through. The document is either going to be standalone. It's either going to be a standalone document, like when you submit to a conference, or it's of course going to be preceding the main text of a published manuscript. So the role and the purpose of the abstracts. Abstracts are incredibly common. That's why you're all here, because you have to write numerous abstracts throughout your academic career. And they vary in difficulty depending on the material covering, and again, the restrictions from the conference or the journal that may be the venue for your abstract. So what the abstract does is it summarizes a study or an article in the simplest possible form. Again, quite brief. An abstract will do one of two things depending on that venue. It's either going to prepare readers to fully read the comprehensive report of your study in that journal article, or it's going to prepare the reader to further discuss details of your study and ask questions in a conference environment. Either way, it's a very brief preamble to something more. All right. So when you're writing a study, this abstract is going to be what people are skimming to determine the sort of relevance it may have and whether they're actually going to read it. The abstract by itself is not going to do a lot for the person because it's not comprehensive. They can't really verify your work, perform their own evaluation of the veracity or the rigor of your study, the validity of your conclusions. They're not really able to do that from an abstract. So it's more of a portal of discovery. And it's important to keep that in mind in the way that you write it. The same thing, if even more so, is true for conference abstracts, because this is all they have to go off of to determine what they want to visit, who they want to talk to during the conference. And it's a preamble to a potential discussion they may have with you to ask questions, to get further details. All right. So the conference abstract precedes something, and it can never truly be comprehensive. And that should influence how you write it. What we're going to do here is focus a little bit more heavily on the conference abstract. I do that not because the conference abstract is more important or more common. I do that because the conference abstract is harder to write. It's a little bit more demanding because it's standalone, because it's not tied to a full article, like you would have your abstract to start your manuscript for a journal submission. It's a little bit more demanding, and using the more demanding example, I think, imparts some of this guidance for how do I be brief? How do I address conclusions? How do I make sure I'm attracting people to ask further questions, get further details, and find out about the full study, right? So it's a little bit harder to do so with the conference abstract. Additionally, the conference abstract by itself is highly competitive because the abstract, when you're submitting to a conference, is all they're going to have to decide on whether you're going to get perhaps a full talk in a symposium environment, or if you're going to have a poster or a lightning talk or any of these other variety of formats. And so it's actually quite competitive, and you have a very minimal document with which to advertise your study. And so that's a bit more demanding, whereas nobody's using the abstract to reject or accept your manuscript paper. You have the entire manuscript to get your point across, to make your arguments. So the conference one is much more difficult, much more challenging for that competitiveness. Okay. So looking again, sticking with the basics, but thinking about what the abstract is for. So the additional functions in terms of what we think about purpose. I need an abstract for my manuscript to submit. I need an abstract to submit for the conference, this type of thing. But why does the journal want the abstract? Why does the conference want the abstract? And the reasons are these. The abstract is a huge determinant of search and discoverability. Again, even more so for conference abstracts, because that's all you have. You don't have the full manuscript underlying it. And so search and discoverability is going to be based on whatever content you put into the abstract. So it's important as a writer to be aware of this when you're preparing. All the terminology that you use is relevant, and you only have, for example, 250, 350 words to allow for that discoverability, where with a manuscript, you have thousands and thousands of words for discoverability. The abstract also functions to connect the appropriate researchers at large conferences. You have a huge number of submissions. Even though they try to group things, right, by field, they try to have lightning talks together on similar research aims or areas of the field, it's still hugely daunting to figure out where you're going to go and who you're going to talk to. And all that people have is the abstract book to go off of. And so it's quite challenging. And when you're writing it, you have to be aware that if you're writing a paper on L name, or if you're writing a paper on basically anything, and even anything that's niche, there's probably going to be a dozen other abstracts shared with that one. And so you have to be cognizant of not getting lost in that sort of sea of abstracts. Another big thing that you should be aware of on the manuscript publication side for your abstract, again, so one that's tied to an article that you're hoping to get published, is the abstract strongly impacts your citation rates for the article. People, again, are using the abstract for search and discoverability, and they're skimming your abstract to decide whether your article is usable, because they're not going to read your article unless they think it's going to be usable for them, right? Citations come about from a position of need, and people often evaluate whether your study will suit their needs in terms of citation based on a skim of the abstract. So the abstract is quite critical there. It's not going to get read if the abstract is not well written. So it does provide significant function here. Something to keep in mind for how it does not function, because this is what people run into. I think the number one reason, for example, students or early career researchers struggle with preparing an abstract is because they try to do far too much. They try to go beyond the scope of what an abstract is capable of doing. And so they end up writing a poor abstract because they're trying to do too much. Because importantly, the abstract cannot stand alone as a comprehensive summary of the study, right? It's never going to be rigorous. You're always going to lack the necessary detail to defend rigor and veracity of the conclusions, because you just can't provide enough information. I could never peer review your study based on your abstract, and that's okay. That's fine. Again, it's there for discoverability, to determine interest, to help guide people to studies that they should be reading. But you have to remember that you can't, because a lot of times people are writing the abstract after they've written the entire paper, and they're trying to apply the rigor with which they wrote the paper into their abstract, and it's a losing proposition, right? You have to accept that that's not possible and write the abstract to best suit the purpose, right? And so that's the most common mistake that like students, for example, make. It's also why they run into trouble of they just have way too much. They're way over the word count, and they're never going to be able to wordsmith it to be shorter. And by wordsmithing, I mean little syntax changes, little grammatical tricks that can shorten, that can decrease your word count. You can always do that, but not if you've started from the wrong place. If you've tried to include too much, there's no way you're going to be able to wordsmith it down. So you just have to accept what the abstract is, and accept what the function is, and write towards those goals is the best way to start. Okay, so breaking down into the sum of its parts. And again, what I've done here is I've bolded the most common terms that are used for structural abstracts. But as I mentioned previously, every abstract has this structure. It's just it's most common at journals, as some of them have what they call a structured abstract versus an unstructured abstract. And it just means you either use these headings or you omit these headings. But either way, you're following the same formula, the same structure. So the first part's always going to be background. Sometimes it's referred to as context or introduction. You'll then go into your aim. Again, it can also be called a purpose. Quite often what people, again, in my background from the life sciences, we're often reporting hypotheses for experimental work. It then moves into the methods. Sometimes it can be referred to as the protocol, study design as well, although study design is much more encompassing and you'll never be able to fit a study design. So I prefer the term methods. Then you have obviously your results. And these are going to be your findings. And quite often for life sciences, there is some degree of statistical reporting, although I'm going to cover how to handle that in a later section. And then finally, all of them are ending with a conclusion section if it's structured, but otherwise there will be some sort of discussion or take-home message based on the reported results. So let's go through them section by section now. Okay, for background. On the left side for each of these, I kind of have what the background is. On the right side, I have some guidance points that I'll try to elaborate on how you best tackle each of these sections. So the background, the entire purpose is simply to provide context. It's an introductory sentence or sentences. One sentence is ideal. If you can just have one sentence that introduces the topic, keep in mind that you already have a title, right? So you already have a title. Descriptive titles are very common now, but even if it's not a descriptive title for a study, kind of like telling you almost like what was found in the results, it's still going to provide quite a bit of information just seeing the title. So this is really, the background is really the second sentence already of your abstract. And that's why it's important to use your title if possible. I do like descriptive titles because they offer a nice summary of what the study found. Some people don't use them. Sometimes it's dictated what to use, whether you use a descriptive title or not. But keep in mind that the title will provide some information before you even got into this background, which is often considered the start of the abstract. So I like one sentence. You can split it into two if it's properly structured. The key thing here, and the most common mistake that I see people making, is that they often use very general context, particularly if they're trying to do two sentences. They'll do a very general sentence for context, and then they'll get a bit more specific. This is really a waste. You really don't have the space to be doing so in such a short format. And so I always encourage people to use the most specific context possible. So for example, in life sciences, particularly like in my area, which is like clinical medicine, there's quite often reference to the disease and the cost to society, right? That is not useful for an abstract. It's far too general. That's the way you might introduce a grant proposal, which is a massive document. It really doesn't have place as an abstract because it doesn't really tell me anything as a reader. Again, I'm skimming the abstract to see where I want to go during the conference. I'm skimming the abstract to see if your study is going to help me with some supporting evidence that I need for a citation in my own manuscript. And so that background, that context I want to see is not general context of like social impact, the big picture of why we care about this. I want to know why you asked your question. And the best way to do that is basically tell me what has been most recently found. Basically the study before your study. What was the most recent finding that triggered the question that you are now asking in your study? One sentence with that context is, I think, the briefest, most impactful way to start your abstract. So that's what I have here. Use the study or findings that are immediately preceding your own questions and aims. So whatever study preceded yours, because typically studies are quite derivative from something else. Whatever you view as the study that most directly preceded yours, reference, not necessarily reference that study directly, but that's the finding you want to bring up. That's the this is what is known type statement you want to put for context to lead you into the next one. So again, avoid field related generalities like the social impact of the disease you're studying, this type of thing. That's relevant and that can go in an introduction section to a full manuscript, but it's not useful for providing context in an abstract. Consider the background wording in relation to the aims. So that's why I showed you all the sections up front. You know now we're about to go into the aims section. You want your background to directly lead into that. So again, the study preceding your study is the best way to create a smooth transition there. This is what has been most recently found. And then it's obvious what your aims are going to be, what questions that you wanted to ask. So those two should go hand in hand, and that transition is quite critical. Also keep in mind that you're trying to target the researchers to whom you wish to speak, right? Again, this is why I don't do general stuff, because if I'm a researcher in microcirculatory control, for example, if I just have a statement about microcirculatory control as my background, as my context, it's not going to help a person who's scanning the program agenda for a conference to pick this one out and say like, oh, this is a poster I want to go check out based on this abstract that the person's written, because there's just going to be way too many. There might be hundreds that are about microcirculatory control. Whatever it is, if I'm investigating, it's quite easy again in the life sciences. I always use these examples, but if I'm investigating a specific mechanism, that's the type of thing that someone's going to identify contextually and be like, oh, this is one I have to put on my list. This is someone I have to go talk to. I've got to ask them questions about this underlying study based on the abstract I'm seeing. Same thing for the abstract for the manuscript. You need the person to see, oh, they addressed this mechanism or they addressed this major question. That's what's going to tell them that your study is relevant to them, and then they'll want to explore more. Okay, so as I said, moving on to the aim or aims of the abstract. The purpose here is to specify the findings that you have pursued. Specificity, again, in this case then, is critical. I limit this to one sentence. Even if you have multiple aims, you can put it in one sentence and just list what the aims are. This is somewhere where you should be able to be quite brief. In terms of guidance, I generally give people on how to structure their actual sentences for this and what sort of syntax to use is, if you have hypotheses, so if you have testable hypotheses, if you're doing that type of experimental work in your field, I would always use a hypothesis. It's the most direct way to state a purpose or an aim. I'm answering this hypothesis. It's the clearest way you can do it. It's fine if you don't, if you're not, if your research is not hypothesis testing research, that's no problem at all. That's not a detriment. But if you have it, I would use that first. Otherwise, you can present them as purpose, aims, or questions is fine as well. I know questions are quite common in theoretical frameworks for like the humanities. So those are all fine to use as well. But again, just very clearly state these. What I like to do is reverse engineer whatever my findings or conclusions are. So I know what my conclusions are. I know what my data showed. I know what my conclusion is. I've already done the study. It's the first sort of thing that you form as a researcher once you've done a study, once you've looked at the data. Because I already know that, I can simply take that and reverse the finding into the question or the aim or the purpose that was asked. And that type of symmetry is going to make it incredibly easy for someone to read and understand your abstract. And their ability to read and understand your abstract rapidly, conveniently, is what's going to make them go into the full paper because they believe they can use it for a citation, or want to come, see whatever your presentation is at the conference and learn more from you. So it's, I think, important to create symmetry there. So again, use this later section to inform on this earlier section with your aims. You can reverse engineer that and make sure it's kind of seamless. Again, as I just mentioned in the previous one, when we covered background, consider what you use for your background sentence, because this is going to function as a preface to your aims, right? So you can see how each one of these ties into each other and how critical these transitions are. And again, target the researchers to whom you wish to speak, right? So again, if you're addressing a mechanism, if you're addressing a theory, if you're asking a specific question, you want that to be up front. That's what's going to trigger a person to add you and add your abstract to their list of ones that they want more information on. Okay, onto methods. So purpose here is to highlight the most relevant methods. Again, it's easy to say for each of these. The purpose is to communicate the methods, but it's a bit more than that. What you're doing with methods in the abstract is you're picking the most relevant methods and reporting on those. The method will have to be simplified. You're basically giving them the big picture about what's the major technique I used, what's the major concept of the study design that I elected to use to evaluate this. If it's longitudinal, if I used a specific technique to measure blood flow, if I used a specific sampling technique, the crux of it is what method allowed you to answer your aims or address your aims. In this case, 2 to 3 sentences is generally allowable. What I quite often find is it's easier to do short, brief sentences and do 2 to 3 of them to explain the methods, because it's relatively straightforward, but it takes a little bit of writing to accomplish. So in terms of guidance for this one, what you're trying to do is pick the one method explanation that directly yields the data for your aim from the preceding section. So whatever your hypothesis you stated, whatever aim or purpose you had, which method is the primary measurement that gives you the data that's going to address the aim? And again, you can think about it for the conclusion too. Whatever you say in your conclusion, what was the method that gave you the data that allowed you to state that conclusion? Now, in general, in any study, we obviously do a lot of different things. There's a lot of verification methodology and this type of thing to ensure the veracity of the conclusions, but there's usually one primary variable that's being used to directionally address a conclusion. And so you just want to pick that one single thing. Keep in mind that the terms you use for your methods, again, particularly if it's like a technique that's popular, novel, this type of thing, those using the appropriate terms for it can be crucial for discoverability. And this applies to the conferences, but in this case, this is also, I think, quite important for if you're publishing the manuscript in a journal, because that's, again, what's going to lead to potential citations. Don't include anything about equipment. Don't include anything about protocol beyond the parameters that are relevant to your conclusion. So if you have, for example, I might have had a muscular contraction modality, a stimulation modality. I might give numbers for that, but only insofar as it's important to understanding the nature of it, that it's rhythmic muscular contraction, this type of thing. Otherwise, I'm not reporting all of the physiological variables that were controlled for during the study. Again, only what's relevant to the conditions I'm testing and thus the findings that I'm discovering. And on to results now. So the purpose is to highlight the results that address your aim, because you're going to have a huge amount of results. Particularly for molecular biologists, this is super challenging. Whenever I work with authors in molecular biology, biochemistry as well, they always have huge trouble because they have massive amounts of results. The amount of data they can collect is incredible. But again, the focus is on what's the first conclusion you give? What's the first major finding you address in your discussion? This is the one that you care about for results when you're writing your abstract. Another big thing that people are wondering about in this results portion is the statistical reporting. And again, with students or early career researchers or people, because people are fresh off of writing the complete manuscript, where it's incredibly rigorous, incredibly tedious for all the statistical reporting. And so then they try to do that in the abstract, and it just doesn't work there. You don't really have the space for this type of statistical reporting. So you got to keep it minimal. And I typically do it parenthetically. So I say the findings directly, variable X increased or decreased or stayed the same or whatever it may be, or was unchanged. And then if I feel the need to report means, if I feel the need to leave the p-value, then I do it in parentheses. Again, it's just going to be a lot easier for clarity because you have such a brief document. You really need to give a sentence structure to the reporting of how the variables changed. If you have numbers, they can be placed parenthetically. That's my general guidance for people. You may deviate from that in certain instances, but I think that's a good starting point for most people. In this case, I think 2 sentences is a good target for this, but a lot of people can do it in 1. I think for any experimental work, usually it's going to require at least 2. Guidance on this section for your results. Again, report the variable that's addressing your aim and conclusion. So particularly if you're hypothesis testing with your aim, whatever variable that you hypothesize to change, make sure that that's the variable you report, and you really don't need to be reporting much else beyond that. Definitely do not attempt to be comprehensive here. It's just not possible. It's like, well, I have to say, like in the manuscript, you say, well, I got to say this, I have to report like this statistic or that statistic, otherwise they don't know if it's valid. There has to be an assumption here. The person's going to have to go to your manuscript. They're going to have to come to you at the conference and ask you further questions in order to determine like the robustness of your study design, of your methodology, this type of thing. You can't accomplish that in the abstract, so don't try to. Just try to give a clear indication of the result that you discovered. It's going to take further discussion with them. It's going to take them reading your full paper in order to verify that, right? And then finally, report the comparison in the briefest terms and only indicate, again, as I mentioned, the statistics parenthetically if needed. Okay, and on to our final section here. Ooh, we're getting a little bit late on time, so I only have 2 more slides here, and then we can get into questions after that. So do a little Q&A session. For the conclusion, the purpose here is to answer the aim, right? So again, skip back to the aim and think about how the aim transitions to the conclusion. So how do I answer the aim? In this case, 2 sentences allowable. The most common thing that people seem to want to do with this is they want to do one sentence that's kind of directly report the result, directly report like the answer to the aim or the answer to the hypothesis testing. And then they kind of do a second one that really speaks to the impact of their research. Like, what does this mean? What's the take-home message? The type of sentence that can then be used as the basis for someone else's context for the next study. This is a very common way to do it. And there's no problem with that. You just, again, have to be concerned about your word count overall. So I like to structure the sentence in the exact same format as the aim. Again, creating symmetry between these sections, creating parallelism in the syntax or sentence structure can make it so much easier to read and digest your abstract, particularly when people are skimming, because that's what people are doing, right? They're skimming your abstract to decide if they want to read the paper. Again, 2 sentences are quite often used. You report the main results sort of finding, like what's the conclusion for the aim that or purpose that you have. And then again, like this sort of take-home message. It's a good strategy, I think. Use the available word count to ensure that necessary qualifiers are in place. This is particularly true for experimental work, like a lot of clinical work. My sentences would always be quite difficult, and I struggle with authors that I'm working on with clinical studies because they have to have a lot of qualifiers. Like they do very controlled experiments, and so the finding is valid, but it's only valid in this species of rat or this cell line under these conditions. And so it's quite a lengthy concluding statement. So you need to kind of pick your words wisely in order to put those qualifiers. But here it is important. I think the most rigorous portion of the abstract should be this conclusion statement. This is the one where you can be, because again, they're taking your statement at face value. You can be more rigorous, include all those qualifiers that you would need to include to the satisfaction of a peer reviewer. You can't do that in the results. You can't do that in the methods. You just don't have enough space to meet the required rigor of a peer reviewer. But I do think you can make a solid conclusion statement that is basically going to be the same exact statement or close to it. You might wordsmith it to do little tricks to get the words counts down, but it's going to be very close to the same statement that you would have in your manuscript itself. Okay, so that's an important thing. Again, for students, early career researchers, I think they miss out on this. This is where you can have your most rigorous statement. Okay, and then this is the last item I just wanted to cover here before we get into questions. Remember, feel free to enter any questions you have in the Q&A as well. I can try to pull some from this. I can try to pull from the chat, but if you can put any questions you have in the Q&A, that'll be much, much easier to pull from. In terms of structure, brevity, and clarity, these are a few extra tips I have, and if you have questions, I can add to these. A couple tricks per word count. You can use M dashes. If you have parenthetical statements, right, something that you would put in parentheses, like as an aside, I actually like to use M dashes. Sometimes it saves you word count depending on how on how they count it for the abstract, because the M dash is connected to the letter of the next word. And so it may treat it as one word, or if it's doing character count and it takes into account spaces, you can save spaces by doing this. For the same reason, I often omit spaces between statistical note annotations. So if I have like P is equal to whatever value, I don't have spaces between any of that notation. It's just together in a single word. One thing to keep in mind, generally speaking, you'll find that if you use active voice, you'll use slightly less words. So this can help keep you under word counts. If you switch everything to active voice, you'll find grammatically that it allows you to skip a few words, which will be quite helpful. I also like to avoid transition words. Therefore, additionally, further, these are very common in manuscripts, and they're great in manuscripts for enhancing readability. They're just not necessary in an abstract, and they take up a ton of space. They're not necessary because the abstract is so structured. It's only 7, 8 sentences, and everybody knows the order anyway. You don't really need these transition words. The best way to transition from, for example, background to purpose, results to conclusion, is by creating symmetry in how you structure the sentences. So the sentences look like one another. You don't need these transition words. Another thing I have people do is, again, this goes with what I talked about in the background when you're providing context, not providing like big societal or historical context, but avoid those historical references. You don't need to list years. You don't need to say such and such was found initially in 1988. There's just not room to be providing this like historical context in any sort of abstract, unless it's critical. There may be some humanities fields where you may provide a year because that's essential to the entire study. There's a chronological element to your aims. If there's a chronological element to your aims, it's fine to include. But for the most part, I encourage people to leave it out. Okay, so questions and discussion. Let's see who we have. Let's see what we have for question. Also, feel free to ask questions. Again, I'm in a unique position where I see more, I see research more broadly than any given scientist because I don't work in a specific field, right? Like I help authors who are writing humanities. I help authors who are writing philosophy papers, who are writing metaphysics papers. And then the next week, I might be helping an author who's writing a cancer paper, an immunology paper. So mathematics, engineering, this type of thing. And so if you have questions about differences between fields, feel free to raise them as well. Okay, I'm going to skip because there was quite a few questions asked in the chat, so I'm going to skip back and forth. But if you can add your questions to the Q&A function, if you go to that taskbar, there's an actual Q&A function. Ask them there, just to ensure I don't miss them. But I'm going to try to start pulling some of these. Oh, people might have questions about the M dash. So the M dash is it depends what word processor you're using, but the M dash can be used like parentheses or like commas for a parenthetical statement. So you have the dash, the hyphen, then have the slightly longer dash, which is the N dash, which is what we use to denote ranges, right? 50 to 100 trees, and we would use N dash. And M dash is the longest dash that you can find on your word processor. And you can use that as a parenthetical. So if you have like an aside in your sentence, you use the M dash because you'll have a single, whatever word precedes it, the M dash is connected to it, and then it's connected to the next word. And so it removes spacing that you would otherwise have if you used parentheses or if you used commas, this type of thing. Okay. Okay, so here's a question that I'll address. It's actually something I should cover, so I apologize. Is there any rule for using special verbs in the abstract? For example, using past or present? That is one thing. Some people will occasionally, again, a lot of early career researchers or students will do an abstract as almost a proposal in terms of the tense. You don't want to do that. Again, it's just the same as a manuscript. You're reporting on something that you've already done. So I would do it in past tense. There are certain fields where you use present tense. That's like the guidance given by journals. So there may be specific situations, but otherwise you're using past tense. You're reporting on something that you've done already. I am going to get questions here about people wanting good examples of abstracts. Trying to think of the best way to do this. Because the problem with an abstract is like the examples are going to be field specific. I will see if I can add some materials. So there's a hub that we have for this webinar that we have that runs continual for every webinar we have. That way people can ask questions on. We can share reference material later on. So go to the LetPub webinar hub on PeerRef, and I will try to leave some resources in there for you that will more, so you can maybe more directly see some like textual examples. Okay, I'm getting questions on, okay, shortening, right? So like wordsmithing, this type of thing. I think I have a couple examples. Let me see if I can screen share some examples I've had. Okay. Can everybody see this page that I'm sharing? I believe it. Yeah, you should be able to. Okay. Just to briefly, so you can find these examples. This one's from Michigan State University that has some example abstracts. Let me choose the communications, arts, and sciences. So I can leave this in the chat. You could potentially use this as a reference. But for example, if I needed to shorten this, if I need to shorten this one, um, the internet has become a primary resource. Let me highlight this for you. The internet has become a primary resource for the general public who seek health information about a variety of topics, including breast cancer. You could actually omit this entire sentence and just go with the second sentence because this is what applies to the given study. This particular research is part of a larger study which evaluated the use of basic design tenets and theoretical behavioral change components in the top 157 breast cancer websites. So you could skip right to this sentence. If you have room, this is a good context sentence. As an example, if somebody came to me and was like, Clark, I have 270 words and the abstract word count limit is 250, here's like examples of what I would do. I would just say the internet is a primary resource versus has become. Again, this is a tense thing. I understand. I might write has become in the manuscript itself, but I can very easily just change this to the internet is a primary resource for the general public, right? And drop a word there. I can also drop who and just say seeking, right? So the internet is a primary resource for the general public seeking health information. So right there in the first 10 words, I've dropped two. This is examples of wordsmithing. So a lot of it's playing around with tense, playing around with the verbiage, as was asked about before, moving syntax around so that you can just omit certain words while retaining your full meaning. And it may not read quite as well, but that's okay in the abstract, right? Like, again, you may write it differently in the full manuscript, but these little tricks can work quite well in the abstract. Second sentence I could give, actually, let me go back to a different one. Let's go to engineering. Okay, so here's a good first sentence. Quantifying the kinetics of denaturation of heated proteins can lead to insight into protein folding, for example. It's a good context sentence for a background statement. It's telling you what's important, quantifying the kinetics of denaturation, right? And it's telling you why it's important because it can lead to insight into protein folding. Now, we can obviously wordsmith this one as well. So what would I do here? I would adopt some of the same strategies I just mentioned. So quantifying the kinetics of denaturation of heated proteins, I would just say leads instead of can lead, right? You could just say leads to insight into protein folding. I would take off, for example. Again, it is an example, and it may be fine if you want to give that sort of reference that it's not just limited to this. That's why the author in this case put for example. That'd be fine in the manuscript, but in an abstract where word count is a struggle, I could very easily leave off this entire thing, for example, and just end it there. So again, you're taking, I don't know, a dozen or so words, and you're already cutting off 3 words just by some very, very simple, again, wordsmithing. I call it wordsmithing because these are things where I don't have to take away material. I'm not like, oh, I have to cut this sentence or I have to cut part of this sentence. I'm simply finding ways to adjust the grammar to save a word here, a word there, this type of thing. Okay, so I hope that kind of maybe gave you a couple brief examples. Again, I'd have to go over this with you, and I'm more than happy to. So again, feel free to visit the hub on PeerRef, and if you want to like give me example sentences from your own abstracts, like maybe you're trying to come up with a really good background for your abstract, I'd be happy to suggest different sentence structures in this type of thing, but I'd have to, see each person's like individual one to give you the best possible advice in that situation. I think, let me just check if there's any other questions. I think that covers most of what we have here. Again, I hope this opens up maybe a bit more discussion with the abstracts. What I may do is, I've done this with previous webinars where I have one that's popular, but a lot of people kind of want maybe direct assistance with their own examples. I may do a webinar in the future where I have an open Q&A session, and it's just a session where you can bring me your abstracts, right? I'll have you share them with me, and we as a group can go over how I would edit them, this type of thing. And I can give you tips and tricks for everybody's sort of individual abstracts. I think people have found that helpful in the past, just to do a session like that rather than this sort of lecture webinar. So be on the lookout. If you're interested in something like that, be sure to let me know, because I want to do the type of content that is the most interesting and the most helpful to you all. Okay, with that, be on the lookout for next month's webinar. So we'll do it about the same time, right smack dab in the middle of February. I'm not sure of a topic yet. If you have suggestions for topics, something I haven't covered before that you'd like me to, please be sure to reach out and let me know. Again, you can leave a comment in the hub. Otherwise, be on the lookout. That first week of February, you'll probably receive an email advertising the next webinar in our series. So I appreciate you all joining me today. I hope you have a great rest of your night, rest of your day, wherever you are. We're all in very different time zones. And I will see you next month. Take care all.